It was a Tuesday in the third week of March 2009, and the sky that morning was the color of old pewter pressed flat against the ridgeline, the kind of sky that holds its cold all day and never commits to rain or sun. I remember the temperature exactly because the thermometer nailed to the corner post of the barn read 31 degrees when I walked out at 6, and my breath hung in a small white cloud that dissolved before I reached the fence. I remember all of it because that was the morning Raymond Cutler pulled his truck into my lane, rolled down the window, and told me, with genuine kindness and not a trace of mockery, that I had finally gone around the last corner of good sense. He said it the way an old friend says a hard thing, leaning on the window frame, looking at the ground between us rather than at me. He said he had heard what I was planning to do with those eggs and that I ought to sleep on it another season before I committed. He drove away before I could answer, and I stood there in the pewter light and watched his tail lights go red at the end of the lane and then disappear. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Raymond was not the only one with an opinion. The Mercer County Extension Office had told me 3 weeks earlier, in writing, that the economics of geese on marginal wetland ground did not pencil, and the woman who delivered that assessment was not unkind about it either. She spread a single printed page across the desk and pointed to a column showing the per-bird return I would need just to cover feed and housing, then pointed to a second column showing what the market had actually returned to producers in our county over the prior 5 years. The gap between those two columns was wide enough to park a combine in. She said, and I am quoting her nearly exactly, that sometimes the most productive thing a person can do with a difficult piece of ground is stop paying taxes on it and let the county take it back to grass. She meant it helpfully. I drove home and sat in the kitchen for a long time before I said anything to my neighbor Doris, who was the only person I trusted to ask a practical question instead of offering an opinion shaped like advice. The ground in question was the lower 43 acres of my grandmother's farm, which had come to me in 2004 when she passed at 89. She had farmed the upper ground herself until her late 70s, but the lower 43 she had not touched productively since the middle 1970s, and there was a reason. The lower 43 sat in a broad, shallow basin that collected water from 3 directions. 2 seasonal draws ran into it from the north and east, and a slow seep came up from somewhere below the clay hardpan on the west side that nobody had ever been able to drain by conventional means. My grandfather had tiled parts of it in 1961, laying 4-inch clay tile at 30-foot intervals across the northeast quarter. The tile helped for a few years, and then the hardpan simply won. And by 1968, the northeast quarter was as wet as ever, and the tile investment, which had run to roughly $1,400 in 1961 money, was buried and forgotten. The ground grew cattails, sedge grass, a few scrubby willows along the draw margins, and in wet springs it held standing water from April well into June. Nobody in my family had called it anything but the wet end for 3 generations, and the phrase carried a tone of resignation rather than description. My grandmother, whose name was Corrine, had not entirely given up on the wet end. She had not farmed it, but she had watched it. She kept a field notebook, a standard composition book, with a black and white marbled cover, every year from 1951 until 2001, when her handwriting became too uncertain to continue. When I settled her estate and went through the house, I found 47 of those notebooks in a cardboard box on the shelf in the back bedroom, organized by year. I brought them all home and put them on a shelf of my own and did not open them for almost 2 years, because grief is its own kind of weather and it takes the time it takes. When I finally did open them, I started at the back with 2001 and read backward toward 1951, and somewhere around 1964, I stopped and read a single entry 3 times. The entry was dated May 9, 1964, and it read as follows, her exact words. Watch the Canadas on the lower end for 2 hours this afternoon. 14 birds working the sedge edge. Ground is damp, but the grass at the margin is green, and close cropped where they have been feeding. Note, the geese are not avoiding the wet, they are using it. The wet is not the problem, the wet is the product. We have been reading this ground backwards for 30 years. I set the notebook down on the kitchen table and looked out the window at the dark for a while. It was February of 2007 when I read that entry, which meant my grandmother had written it 43 years earlier, and the ground had sat there misread for every one of those years in between. I made a note in my own notebook, closed her 1964 book carefully, and went to bed. The idea was in me now, but I knew enough about early ideas to leave them alone for a season and see whether they held. The person I told first was Doris Perham, who had farmed the adjoining 320 acres for 31 years and who had a habit of listening completely before she said a single word. I told her over coffee at her kitchen table in October of 2007, 8 months after reading my grandmother's entry. I told her I was thinking about geese. She held her coffee cup in both hands, looked at the table, and was quiet for what felt like 2 full minutes but was probably 45 seconds. Then she said, "How many?" Not whether it was a good idea, not whether I had thought it through, just how many. I said I did not know yet. She nodded and said she had seen a magazine piece about a heritage goose operation somewhere in the upper Midwest and would try to find it if I wanted to read it. That was the whole conversation. I spent the next 3 months reading everything I could find about geese on wetland ground, which was not as much as I had hoped, because most of what the extension system had published was aimed at commercial commodity production on dry ground or nuisance control, and neither of those was what I was trying to understand. What I was trying to understand was what my grandmother had already figured out sitting on that hillside in May of 1964. She had watched 14 Canada geese work the sedge edge for 2 hours and seen what everyone else who had ever walked that ground had missed. The wet was not the enemy of the land's productivity. The wet was what the land was actually offering. I spent the winter of 2007 to 2008 walking the lower 43 in every kind of weather, carrying a soil probe and a notebook, taking measurements. I pushed the probe every 30 feet, along transects flagged with orange marking tape, recording depth to saturation at each point. The map I drew told me something the old tile layout had never captured. The wetness was not uniform. The west third was genuinely wet, saturated to within 4 inches of the surface for 8 or 9 months of the year. The middle third was intermittently wet, drying to about 14 inches below surface by late August in a normal year. The east third, abutting the slope from the upper farm, was wet only in spring and essentially dry upland by July. 3 different microzones in 43 acres, each offering a different thing if you knew how to read it. A grazing goose does not need the ground to be dry. It needs forage at the margin between water and dry land, which is precisely where the biological productivity of a shallow wetland concentrates. The sedge, the water-tolerant grasses, the emergent vegetation at the draw margins, all of it is nutritionally dense and grows back quickly under managed grazing pressure. My grandmother had not been a goose farmer. She had been a careful observer. But she had seen the system working in miniature with those 14 wild birds, and written it down, and then she had died before anyone read what she had written. The part I had not solved by spring of 2008 was the birds themselves. Heritage breed goslings from a reputable source were running $8 to $12 apiece, and I was thinking about a starting flock of at least 200 birds, which put my hatchery cost between $1,600 and $2,400 before I had built a shelter, strung a fence, or bought a pound of supplemental feed. I had the land. I did not have the capital. It was Doris who heard the news first, in late January of 2009, and she called me on a Wednesday evening to tell me. A regional hatchery about 60 miles north had overestimated their spring order commitments and found themselves holding a surplus of fertile goose eggs they could not place. Approximately 340 eggs sitting in holding while the manager decided whether to run them through the incubators or cut the loss. He had offered them to 2 other operations in the county, and both had declined. Doris had heard it from a man who ran a small waterfowl supply business 2 counties over. She said, "I thought you should know." I called the hatchery manager the next morning. His name was Gerald, and he was a careful, skeptical man who had been in the business for 22 years and did not waste words. He said he would rather hear what I was planning to do with the eggs before he talked about price, and if the plan made sense to him, the price conversation would be short. I told him about the lower 43. I told him about the 3 microzones. I told him about my grandmother's 1964 notebook entry, which I read to him verbatim over the phone. He was quiet after I finished. Then he said, "What breed are the eggs?" I said I did not know. I had only heard of them the night before. He said they were Toulouse crosses, a heavy heritage breed with a strong grazing instinct and a calm temperament on managed pasture, and that if the ground was what I was describing, they would probably work, but that he had learned a long time ago not to use the word probably with first-year goose operations. He would let me have the eggs for $85 flat for the lot, on the condition that I kept records and shared what happened with him at the end of the first year. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I drove the 60 miles north on a Thursday in the first week of February 2009, paid Gerald $85 in cash, and came home with 340 goose eggs in insulated carriers in the back of my truck. I had borrowed 2 cabinet incubators from Doris, who had bought them years earlier for a turkey project she had since given up on, and a third smaller unit from a woman at the County Fair Association who used it for poultry demonstrations. The 3 together could hold about 260 eggs at comfortable density. I set them up in the back room of the barn, loaded them carefully, and started the clocks. That was when Raymond Cutler came by and expressed his concern. He was not wrong to be uncertain. I was running 3 borrowed incubators in a cold barn in February, trying to hatch 340 eggs I had paid $85 for on the strength of a 45-year-old notebook entry written by a woman who had never kept a single goose. Heard from the outside, that story would give most sensible people pause. The incubation period for Toulouse geese runs to 28 days, sometimes 29 in a cool environment, and those 28 days were some of the most attentive work I have done in my life. Temperature management in a cabinet incubator in an unheated barn room in February is not casual. The room temperature swung 8 degrees between morning and night on cold days, and I checked the incubator readings every 4 hours. I turned the eggs by hand twice daily in the unit without an automatic turner. I candled at day 10 and again at day 18. At day 10, I pulled 41 clears. At day 18, I pulled another 17. That left 282 eggs showing development going into the final stretch, a better fertility rate than I had any right to expect from eggs that had been in holding. The hatch began on day 27 and continued through day 30. I sat in that barn room for 4 days with very little sleep and a thermos of coffee that Doris replenished twice without being asked. When it was over, I had 219 live goslings in brooder boxes, yellow-gray and loud and demanding, as if they had arrived already certain the world owed them something. 219 out of 340 eggs. Gerald, when I called to tell him, said that was respectable for a lot of uncertain provenance and winter holding conditions. Not impressive, respectable. That was the right word. I brooded the goslings in the barn for 6 weeks on pine-shaving bedding under heat lamps. By early May, when the lower 43 had dried to its spring margin and the sedge at the wetland edge was showing 4 inches of new green growth, I walked 211 goslings down the track to the lower ground and opened the gate. 8 had been lost to brooding miscalculations, accounted for and regretted. I need to tell you what happened the week before I opened that gate, because it nearly ended the project entirely. A county land use officer came to the farm on a Tuesday, acting on a complaint filed by a person whose name I was not given, alleging that I was running a commercial poultry operation in a zone that permitted only residential agricultural use. He was a young man, thorough and polite, and he spent 2 hours going through the barn and the paperwork I had kept, every receipt, every incubation log, every candling record. He said he would need to take the file back and I should expect a letter within 3 weeks. He could not tell me what it would say. I want to be honest about that night. I sat at the kitchen table with my grandmother's 1964 notebook open in front of me and read the May 9th entry again. I had 211 young Toulouse crosses in the barn, and I did not know whether I would be permitted to put them on the ground they were bred for. I thought about the $1,400 my grandfather had spent on tile that the hardpan had simply swallowed. I thought about the extension office's 2 columns and the gap between them. I thought about Raymond's taillights going red in the pewter morning. And then I read my grandmother's sentence one more time. The wet is not the problem. The wet is the product. We have been reading this ground backwards for 30 years. I decided to trust the slow process. The problem with fast certainty, I wrote in my own notebook that night, is that it never sits with the ground long enough to learn what the ground is actually saying. My grandmother had sat with that ground for decades before she saw what it was offering. I could wait 3 weeks for a letter. The letter came in 17 days. It said the operation qualified as a small-scale livestock and poultry enterprise within the existing agricultural use classification, and that no additional permits were required, provided the total bird count remained below 300. I was at 211. I set the letter on the table and did not say anything for a while. Then I called Doris. She said, "Good, that was all." The first summer on the lower 43 was an education I could not have bought. The geese moved through the 3 microzones in a pattern I had not predicted and would not have designed. Early morning, from first light until about 9, they worked the wet west third, feeding at the sedge margin and in the shallower water. Mid-morning through early afternoon, they drifted to the middle zone, resting on drier hummocks and grazing the water-tolerant grass along the intermittent wet margins. Late afternoon they moved east to the driest third, grazed the upland grass edge, then drifted back toward the shelter at the upper margin of the lower 43 as evening came on. They were doing, in a managed way, exactly what my grandmother had watched 14 wild Canadas do on that May afternoon in 1964. They were using the wet as the product. By August, something had changed on the lower 43 that I could measure rather than just observe. The sedge at the wetland margin was regenerating faster than the geese were consuming it, which told me grazing pressure was within the productive capacity of the system. The water in the shallow west zone pools was clearer than I had seen it in any prior spring or summer, the goose disturbance cycling nutrients through the water column in a way that limited the algal growth that had always made those pools look stagnant. The grass in the middle zone grazed and rested as the birds moved through their natural daily pattern was thicker by late summer than it had been in early May. The ground was not being used up. The ground was responding. I recorded plain measurements. Grass height at 10 marked points in the middle zone averaged 6.5 inches in early May and 9 inches by late August after a full season of goose rotation. Sedge coverage at the west margin I estimated at 60% canopy in May and closer to 75% when I walked the same transects in August. Those are not large numbers. They are honest ones. In October of 2009, a graduate student from the State University's Natural Resources program came to the lower 43 as part of a wetland use study her department was conducting on managed waterfowl systems. She had heard about the project through Gerald. She arrived with a water quality testing kit, a soil probe, a GPS unit for mapping, and the practiced neutrality of someone trained to let data tell her what to think. She was 26 and told me within the first 5 minutes that she was not there to validate anything, she was there to measure things, and I should not take either outcome personally. She spent 2 full days on the lower 43. She pulled water samples from 6 points in the west zone and tested them for nitrogen, phosphorus, and biological oxygen demand. She probed the soil at 20 points across all 3 zones and mapped vegetation coverage by walking transects slowly with her GPS unit. On the afternoon of the second day, she sat at my kitchen table and looked at her results for a while before she said anything. She said the water quality numbers from the west zone pools were better than she expected for a system with 200-plus birds on it. The nitrogen load was within the range she associated with naturally functioning small wetland systems rather than managed poultry operations, which she attributed to the birds moving through the wet zone rather than concentrating in it, distributing nutrient load across the full 43 acres. She said the soil moisture measurements in the middle zone were shallower, meaning drier, than the baseline county wetland survey data for that parcel from 2003, which she could not fully account for. The geese might be affecting the hydrology through vegetation management, but she would not state that with confidence without a second year of data. Then she said, and these were her exact words, "I can't explain these numbers with the model I came in with. I'd want to come back next spring." She came back the following May, and the May after that. By the end of the third year, she had incorporated the lower 43 into her dissertation as a case study in informal managed wetland systems, and the language she used in that document to describe what the geese were doing to the ground was considerably less hedged than what she had said at my kitchen table in October of 2009. She sent me a copy of the relevant chapter. I read it twice and put it in the cardboard box with my grandmother's 47 composition notebooks, because it seemed like the right place for it. The economics of the first 3 years were modest and real. I sold the first cohort of market-weight birds in the late fall and early spring of the first year at an average of $22 per bird through direct farm sales, a regional farmers market, and 2 restaurant accounts that Doris helped me establish through a contact at a culinary cooperative 2 counties over. Of the 211 birds I had moved to the lower 43 in May, 184 reached market weight and sale. The remainder retained as breeding stock. 184 birds at $22 was $4,048 gross. Against that, I set $85 for the eggs, roughly $300 in brooder supplies and heat lamp electricity, about $260 in fencing materials, and a shelter built largely from salvaged lumber that I put at a material cost of about $140. Total first-year investment, approximately $785. Net return, $3,263 from 43 acres that had returned exactly nothing for the prior 30 years. I am not telling you those numbers because they are impressive. I am telling you them because they are accurate, and accuracy is the only language the ground actually speaks. Raymond Cutler came by the farm in November of 2009, after the first market season was done. He drove in that same truck and got out this time, which was different from the March morning when he had kept the engine running. He walked down to the fence above the lower 43 and stood there, looking at the middle zone, where the breeding birds were moving in their late afternoon drift toward the east ground. He did not say much. He said the place looked different from what he expected, and then he said the grass looked better than he would have thought. I did not fill the silence that came after that. I let it sit, the way my grandmother would have. He nodded once and walked back to his truck. By the spring of 2011, I had established a breeding flock of 40 retained birds from the best of the original 211, and I was hatching my own eggs in an incubator I had purchased used for $220. The lower 43 was no longer the wet end in the way that phrase had always been meant in my family. It was still wet. The seep on the west side still came up through the clay hardpan. The draws still ran in spring. The pools in the west zone still held water into June. The wet had not gone anywhere. What had gone was the idea that the wet was the problem. My grandmother had understood that in 1964, watching 14 geese on a May afternoon, and she had written it in a composition notebook that sat in a cardboard box in a back bedroom for 40 years, waiting for someone patient enough to read it slowly. In the spring of 2011, I copied her entry into my own field notebook in full, in my own handwriting, underneath my record of the breeding flock composition and the spring grass measurements. I wrote her name and the date of the original entry beside it. It seemed important to put her observation and the evidence that she had been right in the same document, in the same hand, so that if someone found that notebook in a cardboard box 40 years from now, they would know the two things belong together. The wet is not the problem. The wet is the product. We have been reading this ground backwards for 30 years. She was right, and she had been right for 47 years before I listened. She had written it in 1964, and I had read it in 2007. The lesson is not that geese are the answer, or that wetland ground is always productive, or that old methods beat new ones in every circumstance. The lesson is about paying attention long enough, and humbly enough, to let the ground tell you what it actually is rather than insisting it be what you need it to be. Difficulty is often just carefulness misread. The wet end was not broken. It was waiting for someone to read it right. If you have a piece of ground like that, or a corner of something you have been calling a problem for longer than you can remember, I would like to hear about it. Tell me about it in the comments. Tell me what you have been reading backward and what you think it might actually be saying. I will read every one.